much, Mr. Speaker, and I will be sharing my time with the honourable member for Carleton, one of the great hard-working finance shadow ministers that the minister referenced, was doing so much good work to try to help fix the gaps in the government's programs. Mr. Speaker, the finance minister has just painted an extremely dire picture of Canada's finances. But what we didn't hear was any kind of a plan to support the reopening of our economy and to get Canadians back to work. Coming out of the pandemic, every single country on the planet will be desperately competing for the same opportunities and the same investments. So where is the Prime Minister's plan to set us apart? The United Kingdom has a plan. France, Germany, South Korea, Japan, they all have plans. In fact, every single country in the G7 has a plan. Le gouvernement emprunte 3.
The government is borrowing $343 billion this year, but the Prime Minister has no plan whatsoever to help Canadians return to work, no plan to guide our economic recovery, no plan to stimulate growth, attract business investment, or create the conditions for job growth.
The government is borrowing $343 billion this year for the first time ever. This year, the net federal debt will reach over $1 trillion. In fact, they're borrowing so much money, Mr. Speaker, that the Bank of Canada has to create it out of thin air. The Bank of Canada is purchasing $5 billion worth of government debt every single week. The Prime Minister has absolutely no plan to help Canadians return to work, no plan to guide our economic recovery, no plan to stimulate growth, attract business investment, or to create the conditions for job growth. I know this might come as a shock to a Liberal Prime Minister, but spending billions of dollars does not create economic growth. And handing it out to Liberal insiders certainly won't restart our economy. More Liberal tax hikes, more red tape won't restart our economy. Pour être concurrentiel, nous devons...
To remain competitive, we have to free the power of the private sector, help Canadians go back to work, support small businesses, cut taxes, eliminate red tape, and make Canada an attractive place to do business again.
The misconception right now on the economy is that if we simply lift the restrictions and provinces reopen, our economy will come roaring back to life. The reality is it will take leadership, big ideas, and a lot of hard work. But the Prime Minister's track record proves that he cannot be trusted to lead Canada's recovery. His sky-high taxes, wasteful spending, and massive deficits put Canada in an incredibly weak position before the pandemic began. While a responsible government would have saved while times were good and paid down debt, as our previous Conservative government did, the Liberals added $87 billion worth of new debt during their first 4 years of power. As a result, Canada is the only G7 country to have lost its AAA credit rating and has one of the highest debt levels in the AA category. Before the pandemic, Canada's unemployment rate was higher than all G7 countries, except France and Italy, whose socialist policies the Prime Minister was trying to emulate. Now Canada has surpassed them and has the highest unemployment rate in the G7. In fact, we have among the highest unemployment rates in the OECD, falling fourth, right behind Greece. So this should be a major wake-up call for this government. C'est sûr que les Canadiens luttent.
Canadians are struggling. The last months have been truly difficult. Millions of people have lost their jobs. More than 100,000 Canadians are ill and thousands have died. Businesses have closed and many of them will never reopen. Canadians have been horrified to see their savings disappear.
But despite all of this, as provinces gradually reopen, Canadians are hopeful and optimistic about their futures. They want to work. Businesses want to reopen, to welcome back staff and customers. They are determined to rebuild and are coming up with innovative ways to offer services as provinces.
What we witnessed today was, for the first time in history, something a government called a fiscal and economic snapshot. A snapshot is defined in most dictionaries as sort of a quick photograph, or in modern lingo we call it a selfie, an economic selfie. But this finance minister, in talking for about 15 minutes straight, could not bring himself to utter the size of the debt or the deficit. Now, I will be the first, apparently, to do so. I ask all members to ensure they are in their seats and that they, if anyone out there is listening to this speech while operating heavy equipment, you might want to turn the volume down. This government has now smashed through the $1 trillion debt mark. $1.06 trillion is the size of Canada's national debt. A deficit of $343 billion. To put that into perspective, when this government took office, the entire budget of the Government of Canada was about $260 billion. In other words, they are borrowing more in 1 year than the Government of Canada used to spend in its entire budget not long ago. Now, the finance minister went to great lengths to brag about the low interest rates that he's paying on the debt, as though he somehow set those interest rates himself, which raises questions about his perception of the Bank of Canada's independence. But what he forgets is that those interest rates are temporary, and they're only made possible by the cornucopia of cash that is coming out of the Bank of Canada, a bank which has created through keystrokes on a computer about $400 billion of new currency for government spending in less than 100 days. In other words, that's almost equal to a full quarter of GDP created out of thin air by our central bank. Now, the Prime Minister thinks he's discovered a new idea in creating currency in order to spend it. He'd best look back to history to know that this method of financing state activity can only go on for so long. I raise all of this not because the programs to support Canadians and replace the wages that governments have taken away from them are unnecessary. They are very necessary, of course. When government deprives people through lockdowns and shutdowns of their ability to earn an income, it is the government's job to compensate them for that. And such measures have been necessary and generally, with exception, supported by the official opposition. That said, we know that no nation can go on consuming without producing. The only way for us to continue to exist economically is to once again unleash the full and incomparable power of Canada's 20 million person workforce. Hear, hear. To let free the more than 1 million entrepreneurs and businesses that employ those workers. And that should have been the purpose of today's address, instead of a temporary moment of self-congratulation combined with hypnotic phrases intended to make us feel comfortable with the $1 trillion of debt. We expected the finance minister would arrive here today with a plan to bring our economy back to life. Instead, what he did is brag that his plan is the most expensive plan in the G7. He said, because it consumes 10% of GDP, higher than any other G7 country and higher than the G20 average, because it spends the most money, because it is the most costly, it must therefore be the best. But of course, it has simultaneously produced the worst results. Canada now has the highest unemployment in the G7. We went into the crisis with the highest, save France and Italy, whose socialist policies this government had long been trying to emulate. But now, only 100 days later, our economic position is even worse than theirs, even worse than Italy, which bore among the hardest brunt of the COVID crisis. Today, Canada has the worst job record and posture in all of the G7. In other words, they have spent the most to achieve the least.
When we compare the economy to those of G7 and G20 countries, we can see that the government is taking measures that increase debt and that cost a fortune. But basically, what the economists are saying is that that is the lesser of all evils. Canada has spent more than other countries, for example, Germany, Japan, and France, but it had the lowest debt levels before COVID. And now what we're hearing is that even with this spending, when we compare this with G7 countries, Canada has one of the best GDP to debt ratios in the world, one of the lowest. So that is the least worst situation, if you will. But what we have said for a very long time is, for example, the GAFA web giants. They're not paying their fair shares, their fair share. And so now we're in a situation where the government is spending a lot of money. Everyone has to pay their fair share, and the government must step up and say, listen, web giants, especially given the pandemic, they're doing even better business now. Everyone's watching Netflix, they're going on Facebook, people buy more things on Amazon. Not me necessarily, but those companies need to pay their fair share. Tax avoidance and tax evasion have gone on long enough. The government needs to step up. And so given that the debt is rising, then the money that is being spent must be done so the right way. And that is why we are saying that we had asked for the $14 billion that the government is providing. That's fine to have a deficit for that. With regard to changes to CERB, well, that is going to cost a little bit more. So we're talking about $6 billion, but that incentivizes people to return to work. And, once all the healthcare restrictions are in place and once the conditions are in place, people should be able to go back to work. And so the government needs to adapt these measures to the current needs of the economy. So if we were in April, if it was April, that would be fine. But it's July now, so money has to be spent more responsibly. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, throughout this pandemic, we've been focused on people. We knew that the pandemic's impact on people would be that people would not be able to pay their bills, they would be having trouble and struggles putting food on the table. And so everything we've done in this pandemic has been to push the government to deliver more help to more people. We knew in the beginning that EI would not cover enough Canadians. We know that EI only applies to 40% of Canadians, so we needed to do more than that we needed to push the government to do more than just expanding EI. And so we pushed the government to create CERB and have the amount set at $2,000 per person. And when the Prime Minister wanted to cut off CERB and leave families uncertain about the future, we fought back. New Democrats fought back and we won. But we're not out of the pandemic yet. There's still more that we need to do. Tout au long de cette pandémie, les gens ont eu du mal à payer leurs factures et luttent pour nourrir leur famille et payer le loyer. Et nous ne sommes pas encore sortis de cette crise, de cette pandémie. Les familles et notre économie ont besoin de soutien pour continuer. So come August, when we fought and pushed for the extension of CERB, there are still going to be many families that can't go back to work. There is no work for many people to go back to. Our families, Canadians, and our economy, Canada, needs that support to continue. But with today's fiscal snapshot, we're going to hear from Conservatives who've already laid out and started this argument that that help to Canadians must end. We know that the Liberals will also use the fiscal snapshot as an excuse to cut help to Canadians, to families that need the help. But this fiscal snapshot, though very serious, presents a very important opportunity for a choice. The choice is this. Anytime there is difficulty, we see government after government, in this case Liberal, in the past Conservative, quickly move to putting the pressure on working families, putting the brunt of the pain on everyday families. But they never move to ask the wealthiest, those at the very top, to pay their fair share. So if the government needs to cut costs, they should cut the costs of billions of dollars in giveaways to the wealthiest Canadians. If the government needs to cut costs, and I think the government should, then it should cut the cost of allowing billions of dollars to be lost to offshore tax havens. And if the government needs to increase revenue, which I believe we need to do in this difficult time, we know there are significant companies that have made massive profits during this pandemic, Netflix and Amazon, who pay almost no tax in Canada. And we know that the wealthiest, those at the very top, continue to amass fortunes. So we asked the government to put in place a wealth tax on those who have fortunes of over $20 million. Let's ask the wealthiest to bear the brunt of the pandemic, not the families and the working people who are struggling to get by.
So while I think it's fair to say that all of us in the House would have liked to see an economic update sooner, there's no doubt that the situation in which we find ourselves is unprecedented. And I am not going to be an opposition party critic beating a loud drum about the numbers, which are on their own quite shocking. But they're not a surprise. They're not unexpected. So, yes, this snapshot tells us that our deficit will be $343 billion this year. The snapshot tells us that we've smashed through, as Pierre Poilievre was just saying upstairs, smashed through the $1 trillion debt mark. If, in fact, the Minister of Finance and the Government of Canada were charting a course to this much red ink and this much debt out of some domestic impetus, a political motive, losing track of their senses, all of us in the House would be up in arms. But this has to be taken in context of a global pandemic in which every other country around the world and every other economy is struggling. In fact, Canada's doing better than most, and the reality is we're fortunate that we went into the pandemic with a healthier debt-to-GDP ratio than any other country in the G7 and with full employment. So we are looking at a very significant economic wallop. And what rises to me as being probably the most important sentence in this report, I'll turn to it, it's at page 59, is the reference that, quote, the recovery path is uncertain and fundamentally linked to the equally uncertain health outcomes. So this is, for Greens, a wake-up call to humanity. We look at this and we say, what this tells us is the economy takes a back seat to nature. I mean, we are human animals. We've just got an invisible, parasitic, microscopic virus that's brought a large economy to its knees. But we're not down for the count. We'll come back from this. All the economic indicators in this report, in the fiscal update, don't chart a clear path exactly how we'll do it. But we have got the strength in our economy to do this. It's not great that we've been hit with a pandemic. All things being equal, I would rather COVID-19 had not surfaced. But with a pandemic, this spending was necessary. Otherwise, our economy would have been much more damaged than it has already been. More Canadians would have died. And this is a clear message. Our health as an economy is completely dependent on our health as human beings. If we get control of the pandemic and we don't loosen our resolve and we don't reopen too quickly, we can recover. The biggest economic risks for us right now are in ignoring threats that are essentially not economic or fiscal factors. Our biggest threats are ignoring COVID-19, and I must stress, a bigger threat is ignoring the climate emergency. We cannot rewrite the rules of nature. We can revisit the rules with which we manage our economy. I think it's time to take a serious look at modern monetary theory. It's time to go after the offshore tax accounts. It's time to go after a wealth tax. It's time to ensure we climb out of this economic downturn with investments in the economy of the future, in renewable energy, and in technologies and government programs that are largely going to continue to be government spending to get us out of this, that ensure we survive the climate crisis.